Well, in continuation to what we had discussed in the last lecture on social ecology, which is strongly espoused in the light of what Murray Bookchin has talked about, and slightly in continuation to that, we'll be looking in today's lecture on ecofeminism, or which I call as ecological feminist philosophies. And in this lecture, we'll try to see what ecofeminism stands for and what are the kind of inherent problems which are being raised within this feminist perspective on the issue of ecology. And also in the later part, we'll try to bring in some insights from the Indian context by looking at the Chipko movement, which of course is known to be the first ecofeminist movement in the Indian subcontinent. Now, what normally is being focused in this lecture, or in general what ecofeminism or ecological feminist philosophies talks about, it tries to draw a connection between feminism and environment that is within the theme of environmental ethics, and also a connection between the domination of women and domination of nature, which in a way is operationalized simultaneously. Now, in the last lecture, as I said, in social ecology, we tries to look at how the inherent social problems or the kind of the structure of society in a way is responsible for the attitudes and actions towards nature, the way we relate ourselves with nature. So that sort of the sense of dominating nature, dominating perspective or notion of thinking over nature is to be sort of located in the social context. Now, similarly, even in the context of this ecofeminism, it tries to draw how the idea of the patriarchal mindset of domination of women in a way is also to some extent responsible for this idea of domination of nature. Now, also perhaps this is one of the main gist or thrust of the feminist ecological movement, which has of course started from the West. And for those who are not really familiar about what feminism is, it of course has started way back in the 19th century, way back in the US, where there are different trends of feminist movement. The earliest feminist movement of course was on the demand for political rights, that is the voting rights in America. And then similarly over the years, this feminist movement has evolved and tries to address certain issues concerning women, and ecological feminism or ecology has also perhaps been one of the main focus of feminist movement. This particular term ecofeminism was coined by a French feminist by the name called Francoise Ebond. Now, this particular term was coined in 1974, in the 70s, and by coming up with this particular term, what does Francoise tries to talk about and try to emphasize upon. Now, the term was sort of meant to describe how human race could be saved by women. Now, women in a way is sort of being seen to be not just a producer but also a savior. That is, with the kind of ecological problems and crises we witness, the only one alternative which the feminists perhaps come up with is to put the prefix eco before feminism and then ecofeminism, which strongly advocated about how the human race, if not the environment, could be saved by women by initiating an ecological revolution. So, as a way to counter the oppression of women, that is one, and at the same time the oppression and destruction of nature on the other. So, these two, that is the oppression of women and the oppression or destruction of nature, in a way should be seen as a twin process, and if the destruction of nature has to be stopped, the oppression, on the other hand, the oppression on women should be sort of stopped and uprooted. So, only then there will be sort of a lasting solution. Now, ecofeminism is ecological because the preservation, the emphasis is on preservation of the ecosystem, and also this perhaps is the main focus and objective of ecofeminism. And also the feminists, on the basis that it offers ways to recognize and counter male favoritism. In the last lecture, we also talked about why the technological advancement or technology is not the key to solving the ecological problems, because the more finer and finer or technology is being modernized, it sort of give an upper edge to the man or the male, because it is more user friendly to them, and in the process the space of women is being narrowed down, and they are being brushed aside and isolated in the whole process of this sort of evolutionary process which we have dealt and located in the context of social ecology. Now, similarly, this sort of favoritism which is mainly being given to the male should in a way be countered or vehemently opposed, and in order to preserve the ecosystem is something which ecofeminism strongly talked about. Now, what does this ecological feminist philosophy in a way tries to highlight, and then what are the guiding principles of this philosophy? Now, ecological feminism is a variety of one among those different feminist perspective, which of course focuses on the nature of the connection between the feminism of women and the other oppressed humans and the domination of nature. So, it does not limit to the domestic space where women in a way is being oppressed. Rather, it also tries to go beyond the boundary of the domestic space, that is how other humans are being oppressed, or how they are being sort of exploited by other fellow humans, and also the idea of domination of nature has to be addressed. This is something what ecological feminism strongly espoused. Now, ecological feminist philosophy in a way is a philosophical approach which emphasizes to the variety of different connections between feminism and environment, and how does one tries to connect between feminism and environment? Is it simply the economic factors or certain other factors? So, in some way the social is being expanded, and then it tries to look beyond the social structure, and of course, the starting point is socially constructed, and then it moves on to other domain. Now, this different perspective of some of the feminist perspective can be divided into different ideology or school of thought, that is the liberal, it can be the traditional Marxist, can be radical, and socialist feminism. Now, the feminist philosophy in a way can be break down into different school of thought. Now, what does the feminists in general have in common? That is what all ecofeminist philosophers tries to sort of question is the view that there are important connections between the domination of women and other human subordinates. The other human subordinates are those mostly the have-nots, or we can talk about those the farmers, if not the working class, who doesn't have much of a say or a stake in terms of relating themselves to the nature or natural resources. And the domination of nature and that a failure to recognize these connections in a way has immensely resulted in inadequate feminism, environmentalism, and environmental philosophy. So, therefore, this all add together in a way is perhaps one of the main focus of ecofeminist philosophers, and they have in a way contributed differently of how to counter this idea of oppression of women, if not domination of women, and alongside the domination of nature. Now, as the ecological feminism or ecofeminism talked about, there is a deep connection between feminism and environment, and how does one situate and locate this connection? And of course, one needs to look back at history and tries to link and find out the causal relationship between these two. Now, ecofeminism is perhaps a recent development in feminist thought, which strongly argues that the current global environmental crisis is a predictable outcome of the patriarchal culture. So, historically, one needs to situate how this environmental crisis began, and of course, ideology is important, and this patriarchal culture or ideology is pretty much influenced by the dominating, if not authoritarian character, or how men perceive women. Now, therefore, this perhaps can be the starting point of how this idea of the crisis in a way has been witnessed and encountered at this recent time. And perhaps you can also look at some of the ecofeminists like Spernert and Riesler, who also tries to trace the historical and causal connections to the prototypical patterns of domination, which began right from the period when the Indo-European societies were invaded. Mostly the colonial encounters, which of course is being witnessed by many of the native and aboriginals in a way, has sort of tries to look at or if not the beginning of this idea of domination began from the colonial period. Now, Rain Esler describes the time before this invasion as sort of matrilocal, matrilineal, peaceful agrarian era. Now, perhaps with the evolution of time, that is the post-invasion, many of the ecofeminists in a way tries to espouse that the boundary or the space of women are being invaded, and it somehow had led to a different way of looking at what family used to have been, because earlier the kinship relations were being strong, and when the sort of the simple agrarian community were seen to be much more peaceful. And Ruther also focused on the historical role played by rationalism and important conceptual dualism in classical Greek philosophy. Now, still other feminists like Caroline Merchant and Vandana Shiva attempts to focus on the cultural and scientific changes, which of course were responsible for the exploitation of nature, and which of course with the scientific advancement has resulted to unchecked commercial and industrial expansion, and also eventually to the subordination of women. Now, therefore, there are different trends which are being perspective which are being followed by the feminists themselves, who tries to draw the connections by tracing the historicity and the causal relationship, and on the other, why this sort of domination is to be located and contextualized by focusing on the cultural and scientific development. Now, and which all have in a way contributed to the subordination of women. Now, if you look at the way in which domination has or the idea of domination is being exercised or operationalized. Now, the ecofeminist and ecological feminist philosophers, namely Griffin and Merchant or Plumwood, have categorically argued that ultimately these historical and causal links between the domination of women and of nature are to be located in conceptual structure of domination, and also in the way how women and nature have been conceptualized, particularly in the Western intellectual tradition. Now, why this has to be in a way segregated and looks from the Western intellectual tradition, and to what extent this idea is different in other parts of the world. We will come to that in the later part of our discussion. And to begin with, since this sort of notion of thinking or this idea or the ideology is being guided or contextualized within these Western intellectual traditions, which in a way talks about rationality, reason, and how men are sort of supposed to be guided by rational action, in a way has to be historically located. Now, as I said, this domination of women and nature is a twin process, and therefore, this twin domination of women and nature is to be seen in terms of a value dualism, that is disjunctive pairs in which these disjuncts are seen as oppositional rather than as complementary or complementarity, and rather as exclusive and opposite to what it is being to be seen as inclusive. So, it is this sort of dualism has been inherent, and also the value hierarchies, that is how this hierarchy is being organized, and which in a way has include region in opposed to emotions, mind, body, culture, nature, human nature, and man women dichotomies. So, all this dualism in a way has to be sort of seen as a disjunctive pairs in the context of the history and causal connections between women and nature. One particular role of feminism and environmental ethics in this context is to challenge and attempts to expose and dismantle these dualisms, that what we had discussed, that rational, emotions, mind, body, so on and so forth. So, this dualism needs to be dismantled or deconstruct, and in the process one needs to rethink and reconceive those mainstay of philosophical notions, particularly reason, rationality, knowledge, objectivity, the self as knower and moral agent, which perhaps rely on them. Now, within this conceptual framework, one can look and talk about the oppressive patriarchal mindset which has been operating right from the dawn of history, and which of course has particularly sprang up in a volatile manner in the post-invasion period. And within this conceptual framework, if you look at, there is all social ism of domination, example racism, talk about classicism, talk about heterosexism, sexism, as well as naturism, or the unjustified domination of non-human nature, are to be clubbed together within the rubric of this oppressive patriarchal framework. Now, what is this idea of empirical and experiential? Empirical in a way is empirical and experiential is again based on rationality, and many ecofeminists and ecological feminist philosophers have done an extensive research and documented the empirical evidence by linking feminism and the environment. How? Because some of these ecofeminists and ecofeminist philosophers cite their experiential connections which honor and celebrate important cultural and spiritual ties of women and indigenous peoples in the in terms of their natural resource management or their relationship with the forest or the environment. Now, based on an extensive case studies in different cultural groups and societies, they come up with an empirical data and tries to look at how women in a way occupies an important position in the relationship with the spirituality status or position. Now, alongside this critical theory in a way provides a critique of the nature versus culture. How? Because through an epistemological structure for critiquing the relationship between the domination of women and domination of nature. So, critical theory in a way tries to challenge this dualism which exists between nature and culture, and by critiquing this dualism or dichotomy, it also tries to looked at in a more critical manner the way how domination of women and domination of nature is related, how this has to be perceived in a similar manner. Now, many ecofeminists like Murphy and Saleh attempts to explore the symbolic association and devaluation of women and nature that appears in art, literature, religion, and theology. So, they tries to locate the symbolic importance or the symbolic meaning which is inherent in terms to explore the position of women, how they are being sort of devaluate the relationship between women and nature, or the personification of women as nature, how they are being personified in different aspects like art, literature, religion, so on and so forth. Now, the other ecofeminist also explores the symbolic connections between the sexist and naturist language, that is, how language inferiorize women and non-human nature. Now, the manner in which vocabularies or language are being used in a way also to some extent relate or tends to show an oppressive and dominating ideas on women. Now, things which are soft or which are much more seen to be needing a care is oftentimes being related with women. For instance, flowers, or maybe for instance even the idea of how we give meanings or relate to colors, like for example like pink and so on and so forth are always seen to be symbolizing this feminine character. So, these are something how languages are also developed in a cultural group, and this perhaps tends to sort of communicate and relate women with the non-human nature. Now, this may also involve perhaps the feminists tends to raise questions about whether this sex gender language used to describe mother nature. Mother nature, why? Because nature is seen to be something which as seen as the provider. Now, and since nature is located in this domain of the provider, it is to some extent seen as a mother figure. So, perhaps maybe one idea or the main challenges which the feminist in a way tries to question is also about how sex gender language is being used. Nature is often described in female and sexual jargons. For instance, nature is to be, oftentimes we use the term exploited. We can also use like nature is being raped, mastered, conquered, controlled, mined, and also tamed. The word tame in a way is also being used in the social context, because women mostly oftentimes are being seen to be suppressed and tamed. And maybe even in the Indian context, you would come across how the Jat community in a way treated women, and how this sort of idea of domesticating or maybe suppressing women has been sort of a cultural experience in different societies differently across time and across regions. Now, her secrets are in a way penetrated, and her wombs is put into the services of the man of science. Now, interestingly, as I was talking about the different perspective on the feminism, like the liberal, the radical, and the Marxist. Now, the Marxist ecofeminist or the Marxist feminist in a way tends to equate the kind of exploitation which is being meted out to women as something called doubly exploited. Now, even if you forget about the modern industrial society, even in the simple agriculture community or society, when there's no much of a gender discrimination, or maybe until the realization came into being, women were still being doubly exploited, because the Marxist feminist talks about how the amount of input and the amount of work or hours or number of hours which a woman has to sort of talk about, or in terms of the production, how they involve. Now, for instance, a woman in a way does a number of domestic chores, and maybe from the dawn to maybe in the morning, and then it continues, and after a point maybe the husband and the wife goes to the field and toil the whole day and come back again, and women doesn't still have a leisure time, because she has to engage herself and keep herself busy with the other cooking, caring, feeding, so on and so forth. Now, if you look at the number of hours, or if not the amount of labor one has sort of exerted, women in a way has been sort of exerted a lot numbers, and at the end of the day, when the harvesting comes, ultimately the products, that is the food crops, is in a way owned by the man, that is presumed to be like the head of the family. Now, even when the woman has sort of labored so much, the final product, she doesn't have much of a say and a control. So, in a way, the Marxist feminist tends to see that as not from the perspective of alienation, but rather as women are being doubly exploited. Now, even in the modern contemporary period, we can always look at women which are seen to be the kind of terms and jargons which a man usually use if their spouse is not an employee. For instance, in a normal conversation, you'll come across that what does a wife do, and then the husband would normally say that oh, she's a housewife. Now, this particular uses of this sexually segregated gender language is something which the feminist, if not the ecofeminist, tries to restructure and then reconceive, because all these jargons in a way are impregnated with the psyche which is revolving around in the society, and this perhaps in a way is also how we relate to nature as not something rather as a provider, and then which needs to be exploited, which has to be tamed, and then wherein nature is seen to be the provider of wealth, and then men successively with the use of maybe science and technology have tends to engage in exploiting or extracting of resources. Now, if you look at this the ecofeminist philosophical ethic, mostly in the literature on feminism and environment, has in a way linked it to ethically, and then one needs to look at the moral and spiritual dimension, and how women are being positioned or to be linked with in terms of the environment, or maybe in other aspects, that is in art, literature, and so on and so forth. Perhaps one of the popular claims is that the interconnections among these conceptualizations and treatment of women vis-a-vis animals and non-human nature require a feminist ethical analysis and responses. So, maybe this can in a way perhaps tries to restructure or deconstruct the psyche which has been inherent in different cultural groups and society. Now, minimally, the goal of this feminist environmental ethics is to develop theories and practices, as we had talked about how the scholars and philosophers were engaging in collecting certain kind of experiences and data, empirical data, in order to look at how women, the position of women is to be restructured. The concerns regarding humans and natural environment, which are again not simply based on the idea of Western patriarchal mindset or male bias, and which provide a guide to the action in the pre-feminist present. Now, this environmental ethics or the philosophical ethics tends to recognize the significant relationships shared among the indefensible treatment of women and of nature, and they involve a certain kind of commitment to developing ethics which are not male biased, or rather which is not purely guided by the science or scientific ideas, which in a way is guided by the Cartesian principles. Now, if you try to position it or talk about how the domination of nature in a way is to be linked and related with the domination of women, these critiques based on the domination of nature in a way tends to surpass and goes beyond the mere condemnation of the ecological crisis to reveal a connection between the domination of non-human nature, social domination, and psychological domination. And these philosophers argue that as nature comes to be viewed as nothing more than the material for human domination, we develop certain kind of an anthropocentric view that is man above nature, in which we see ourselves as measure of all things. Now, nature then ultimately becomes an external other, merely the stuff of domination. So that sort of boundary or demarcation oftentimes arises the moment when nature is being perceived as the other, which doesn't have a connection or a relation with human and old. Now, perhaps Marx's critique of this capitalist exploitation is renewed and extended in a critique of the domination of nature that attempts to uncover the psychic and social basis of the solidification of this repressive society. Now, the question is, should we say that the modern industrial society is repressive or oppressive? So, one can critically look at or observe the manner in which how this idea of domination or relationship with nature is being perceived. The domination of nature in a way is shown to entail the social and psychic consequences that result in the ecological crisis, for example, the patriarchal domination and the repressive political forms in both the capitalist and the socialist societies. Now, what then would be the best possible or best societies? Is it the capitalist or the socialist? Now, in social ecology, we also talk about how the property or resources are to be owned by the community, or this communitarian ownership should be inculcated. But to what extent will that affect or change the perhaps the psychological dimension in terms of how we relate to nature? So, will that be a feasible or a lasting solution? Now, the instrumental reason is revealed as the specific form of reason through which nature is mastered. Now, instrumental reason again is guided by the accumulation or the idea of that the nature is to be wrapped, tame, so on and so forth, in the basic interest of human to serve their own purpose. Now, as I was talking, we need to locate women in the spiritual dimension. Sandilands described this spiritual ecofeminism as, where I quote, the resacralization of nature, of the divine feminine inherent in all living beings. It is seen as a part of a process of reconnection or re-establishment of ways of knowing and being in the world that have been lost in the history of patriarchal domination. Now, what then is spiritual ecofeminism? So, in a way, it tries to develop or reconnect women to nature. And if you looked at Googled for more information, or for you to have a basic idea of this, you can look at the works of how the rediscovery or reinvention of the Garden of Eden. So, if you type reinvention or rediscovery of Eden, you'll come up with certain feminists who tries to espouse by drawing the sanctity and to redraw the connection between women and nature, which perhaps is being destroyed or destruct as a result of the patriarchal domination. Now, spiritual ecofeminism is nothing but it tries to bring in the sacredness or sanctity of women's relationship with nature. Now, this idea that women are, because of their womanhood, spiritually close to nature is central to the ecofeminist thought and is in a way manifested and shown in different forms of how nature is related to religion, maybe even in the West or in the East, often in forms of worshipping in the inner good goddess that resides in the women. Now, we will try to best exemplify this in the context of India, how in the Indian cosmology, how women is being perceived vis-a-vis nature. Now, from the Indian point of view of how cosmology is being situated in both the exoteric and esoteric traditions, the world in a way is being produced and renewed by the sort of the interplay of dialectical relations between the creation and the destruction, cohesion and disintegration. Now, from this perspective, that is the Indian cosmology, women in a way has sort of to be seen as an interplay of these exoteric and esoteric traditions. Nature, irrespective of whether it is animate or inanimate, is thus an expression of energy, that is the Shakti. And the feminine creative principles of the cosmos in conjunction with the masculine principle, that is the Purusha, namely with nature, that is Prakriti, all together creates the world. So, therefore, from the viewpoint of Indian cosmology, it is this idea of the interplay of this Shakti, Purusha and then Prakriti in a way is responsible for creating the world. Now, how does one tries to locate the domination of nature or domination of women, or if not men versus nature, from the perspective of the West and India or the Indian context. Now, if you look at different literatures or scholarly works, the contemporary Western views of nature are loaded with the dichotomy or duality between men and women, or person and nature. So, in a way, this dualism or dichotomy which exists between all these are sort of seen as how women are being perceived. Now, in Indian cosmology, by contrast, person and nature, that is the Purusha and Prakriti, are a duality in unity. They are inseparable complements of one another in nature, in woman, in man. That is, women and man are together and they are inseparable entirety. Now, this idea of dualism, which is seen in the context of the Western world, is something which is unknown and unacceptable from the Indian cosmological point of view. Now, every form of creation bears the signs of this dialectical unity, that is unity of diversity within a unifying principle, and this dialectical harmony between the male and female principles and between nature and man becomes the basis of the ecological thought and perspective in the Indian context. Now, it is pretty much evident and clear that there is this sort of dualism and dichotomy which exists between man and nature is not something which has which is present in the early classical texts of the Indian cosmology. Now, how is this environment then perceived as a resource? As I often talk about, this Cartesian concept tends to perceive environment as a resource of putting this dualism, that as environment as separate from man. Now, this dualism between man and nature has in a way resulted into the subjugation, if not domination, of the latter by man, and given and it has resulted to the new worldview in which nature is seen as inert and passive, and also uniform and mechanistic, also separable and fragmented within itself, separate from man, and also inferior to be dominated and exploited by man. Now, this Cartesian concept, or the Western notion of perceiving environment, in a way has led to the rise of a new world, and sort of give a new meaning to nature, how it is being seen to be not just anthropocentric, but also to be seen as from an instrumental point of view. The rupture within this nature and between man and nature is in a way as an associated transformation from a life force that also sustains to exploitable resource characteristic from the Cartesian viewpoint. Now, ecological ways of knowing nature are necessarily in a way participatory. Now, nature herself is the experiment, and women as which is pretty much engaged in silviculturalists, agriculturalists, and water resources managers, traditional natural scientists, are in a way to be linked that women is nature as women and nature are both passive in character. Their knowledge is ecological and plural, which also reflect both the diversity of natural ecosystem and the diversity in culture that nature-based living rise to. Now, therefore, this idea of how ecofeminists tries to locate and espouses the women have much more of a holistic knowledge, and then the way they handled nature is not just from the idea of or a notion of the earth being a provider, but in return women in a way, or man has a responsibility to take care of the earth. So, therefore, this mutual, if not a harmonious relationship, can in a way be established. Now, with the violation or with the excessive exploitation of nature, oftentimes is linked with the violation or the oppressive stance which is being meted out to women, especially in the third world. Women produce, not just produce, but also reproduce life by not merely through the biological forces, but also through their social roles in providing sustenance. Now, all ecological societies of forest dwellers and pigeons, now I am talking about how this idea of nature or women is being perceived in the third world countries. Now, whose life is organized on the principle of sustainability and reproduction of life in all its richness, also embody the feminine principles. Now, this idea of the produce and reproduce has to be located not just from the standpoint of a biological perspective, but also in terms of their social role in providing sustenance. Now, Maria Mais has called women's work in producing sustenance, that is the production of life, and also views it as a truly productive relationship to nature, because women not only engage themselves in gathering food or consumed what grew in nature, but they made things grow. So, this idea of reproducing is pretty much innate in the character of a woman. So, therefore, they draw certain kind of deep connections, particularly in the third world countries, that they are pretty much dependent on the natural surroundings, because it not just only provide a food, but also certain other requirements. In the works of Vandana Shiva, you can actually see how women in a way relies on their surrounding natural resources, not just for their consumption, but also as providing an extra income by selling all those forest products to the nearby markets. So, in a way, they have that kind of dependence on nature. Therefore, this women's interaction with nature, with their own nature as well as the external environment, was sort of a reciprocal process, and they tends to conceive of their own bodies as being productive in the same way as they conceive external nature as being so. So, therefore, when one's sort of a realization or an ecological awareness is important in this context, and perhaps the standpoint or the perspective in the third world countries in a way can perhaps be linked with the idea what the ecofeminist philosophies tries to strongly espouse. Now, although women appropriate nature, their appropriation in a way does not constitute a relationship of dominance or a property relations, which means it doesn't cater to a harmful impact on the environment like what others do, like for instance the corporates, or if not the industrialists normally engage into. Now, women are sort of not the sole owners or proprietors of their own bodies, and similarly of the art, but rather they tend to cooperate with their bodies and with the art in order to let grow and to make grow. Now, this sort of produce and reproduce is to be seen in the context of how women perceive themselves, that is their body, and then at the same time the earth, that is the provider. Now similarly, if one have that kind of deep rooted ecological awareness or sort of a realization, one might not possibly engage in harming if not the idea of domination or dominance might perhaps not prevail. Now, as producers of new life, they also became the first subsistence producers, and also the invention of the first productive economy by implying from the beginning of social production and the creation of social relations, that is of society and history. Now, how does this gender ideology versus the recovery of this feminine principle to be contextualized? We have seen the kind of the categories of this masculine and feminist as something which is, being learned as a result of socialization, that is socially and culturally constructed, that is which begins in the family. Now, this gender based ideology in a way projects these categories as biologically determined, or which in a way, as I often say, can be contextualized from the essentializing this idea of the biological aspects of differences between men and women. Now, the Western concept of this masculinity that has dominated development and gender relations has excluded all that has been defined by culture as feminine and has legitimized control over old counts as such. Now, another feminist who has extensively written on the women, that is Simone de Beauvoir, talks about how this feminine and masculine are biologically established, and perhaps as a result of this, women's liberation is prescribed as masculinization of the female, that is women's liberation is to be located or contextualized in the biology, that is in the physical body, from bondage to life's mysterious processes. So, therefore, in a way to liberate is to masculinize the female. It consists of women battling against the elements of becoming masculine. Now, you can perhaps also refer the works of Judith Butler, where she talk about the gender troubled. Now, there are lots of sorts of feminist philosopher which tries to depict and talk about how this gender, which is socially and culturally constructed, has also to some extent led to the kind of relation between man and nature, or the sort of idea of this feminine principle. Now, as Mice points out, the patriarchal myth of this man, which usually engage in hunting, implies the following levels of violence in man's relationship with nature. Now, usually, as I was talking, in the third world countries, women usually engage in collecting the forest products, like the fruits, the roots, and so on and so forth, which in a way is not hampering too much the to the biodiversity in a sense, but the kind of profession which man usually is perceived or expected to engage, as Mice pointed out here, in a way has conditioned the relationship of man with nature. The hunter's main tools in a way are not instruments with which to produce life, but to destroy it. It is not it doesn't reflect the idea of reproducing, but rather to destroy or destruction. This gives hunters an overriding power over living beings, both animals and humans, which does not arise out of their own productive work. And secondly, this objective relationship, which is mediated through the use of arms, that is violence, therefore is basically a predatory or exploitative one. Now, therefore, the kind of profession, if not how man engages by using not just the tools, in a way has sort of reshaped and conditioned their relationship with nature.
Now, the objective of relationship to nature mediated by using these arms in a way constitute a relationship of dominance and not of cooperation between human and nature, and therefore, this appropriation of natural substances, which is in a way talked about Marx, now also become a process of one-sided appropriation, that is, of establishing property relations not in the sense of humanization, but in the context of exploitation of nature. So, this idea of property, if not the idea of sense of ownership, where men in a way have excessive rights to control, in a way is being developed through this appropriation of natural substances. Mice concluded by saying that while this patriarchal paradigm has made man the hunter and exemplar of human productivity, he is basically, to be branded as a parasite and not a producer. Now, this sort of destructive persona, which is pretty much embedded in man, in a way has eventually led to engage in a more destructive nature. Now, women in the forests have been for in the history of Indian civilization has been pretty much related with women, and also primarily with the source of life and fertility. And the forest also is seen as a community which has been viewed as a model for societal and civilizational evolution. Now, this is how the Indian civilizations address or perceive forests, and also they are seen as a source of life, and which is venerated as sacred, which we have discussed at length when we talk about the relationship between religion, ecology, or maybe in the context of the different religion perspective like Buddhism and the Hindu religion. The forest does in a way nurture an ecological civilization in the most fundamental sense of harmony in nature, which of course we don't have to go in deep detail again, presuming that you are familiar with how religion in a way tends to conceive nature if not forest. Now, a critique of the gender analysis which Shiva and Rashni Kothari provided draws our attention, wherein an explicit and often implied equivalence between women and nature, as if women are by definition seen as conservationists, life enhancing and equity seeking. So, therefore, this idea of perception which is being sort of the language which is being used as a category of gender is strongly being criticized by Shiva and Kothari. Now, with respect to Shiva's line of spiritual ecofeminism and also towards the many that see tradition as sort of the savior of sustainable natural resource management, there are many counter arguments to be aware of. Therefore, ecofeminism also has a tendency to focus on an essentialized idea of women. Now, without much ado, I'll just I'm sure you are pretty much familiar with the ecological feminist philosophies by now, and then sort of I would like to present a case in the Indian context where the perhaps the first ecofeminist or the environmental conservation movement has started. And I am pretty sure like many of you might be aware about the Chipko movement. Chipko in the literal meaning is which means hugging a tree or embrace, as the village were engaging in hugging the trees, locally known as the Angwal. The movement, this Chipko movement, is best known for its its tactic of hugging trees to prevent them being cut down and to prevent commercial timber harvesting. As we had discussed about the Bisnoy community in terms of conservation of biodiversity or forest, in a way this the Chipko movement is pretty much influenced by the Bisnoy community in Rajasthan. Now, this particular movement began as a result of the government's decision to allot the forest trees for the sports good company. You know what the woods are used for instance, maybe making a cricket bat, so on and so forth. So, and then different items of the sports goods in a way demands the use of the forest raw materials. The local residents of this Gopes were denied the similar demands of getting new fee trees required for making farm tools. So, that sort of indifference which are being meted out, whereas the government favoring the sports company, and on the other hand denial of accessing the forest for making the agriculture tools. That sort of dichotomy in a way is being inherent. Now, the first and foremost who began with this movement was Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who in a way tries to begin this idea of movement by coming up with establishing a small industries to employ the youths. Now, in one of the what Prasad has in a way expressed is, let them know we will not allow the felling of a single tree. When their man raises their axes, we will embrace the trees to protect them. So, with so much of commitment and dedication, and with the realization that they can't do away without, or they can survive without the forest, this sort of commitment is being seen in the context of the Chipko movement. And in the words of Chandi Prasad, we can see that our movement goes beyond the erosion of the land to the erosion of human values. The center of all this is humankind, and if we are not in a good relationship with the environment will be destroyed and we will lose our ground. But if you halt the erosion of humankind, humankind will hold the erosion of the soil. So, this perhaps is the guiding principle of the Chipko movement. And another elderly woman by the name called Gaura Devi, which is the head of the village of the Mahila Mangal Dal, was also instrumental in mobilizing the village women for the movement when the company were the lumberjacks were marching towards uprooting or felling the trees. Now, she in a way declared that the forest nurture us like a mother. You will only be able to use your access on it, but you have to use them first on us. So, that sort of dedication and sacrifices is pretty much seen in one of the leaders. And of course, Sundarlal Bahuna was also part of the movement. He is an environmentalist and also received this coveted award called the Padma Bhushan for his contribution in the movement. Now, this movement in a way is an environmental conservation movement which come to the public attention way back in April 1973, when a group of women in Mandal village, which was located in the mountainous Himalayan region of Uttarakhand, hugged the trees in order to prevent them from being felled. Now, in the next several years, more than a dozen of confrontation between women and lumberjacks, that is those companies or occur in Uttarakhand. And similarly, old, non-violent and effective enshrining, that is by using the tree hugger in conservation parlance. Now, in 1974, if you look at a remarkable confrontation occur in the rainy village of Uttarakhand, where a women's group led by Mrs. Gaur Devi blocked an army of lumberjacks by saying that this forest is our mother's home and we will protect it with all our might. So, through this they also admonish the lumberjacks that if the forest is cut, the soil will be washed away, that is the erosion will eventually takes place, and this will result to landslide and soil erosion, and which will bring more floods and destroy our fields and homes. Our water sources will dry up and all other benefits we get from the forest will be finished. So, they have perhaps seemed to be foresee all these calamities if the forests are being destroyed or the trees are being felled. So, such kind of ecological awareness was pretty much inherent in them, and therefore, this idea or commitment of fighting against the lumberjacks was continued. This notion of cut me down before you cut down a tree, in a way gets a lot of media's attention, and which also bring a new humanized morality to abstract environmental concerns. And one of the poet also Ganesham Salani, which talks about by penning some verses, talks about let us protect and plant the trees, go awaken the villages and drive away the excrement. So, this sort of the idea of the Chipko movement was first they have those leaders like the environmentalists Sundarlal Bahuna, and also who in a way are being aroused, if not motivated by their own lady, that is the women. Now, the Chipko movement in a way gathered this rapid momentum as it rode the wave of this spirituality, and by trying to relate themselves with the forest, and by organizing certain kind of these prayer meetings, which in a way tries to we can perhaps say that sort of a cultural politics is also being inherent and used in this particular movement. Now, they tend to perceive themselves as a custodian of these forests, because it is where the spirit, if not the God, resides, and they have this sort of trying to draw or maintain certain kind of spiritual connection between them and the forest. Now, this particular movement in a way can be interpreted differently from different feminist perspective or different ideologies. The feminist movement in a way popularized this Chipko by pointing out that the poor rural women walk long distances to collect fuel and fodder, and thus are the frontline victims of forest destructions. So, for any kind of destruction of environment or resources, the first and the foremost victims or the brunt is bear by the women, because they are the one who are directly dependent on this, not just as fuel and fodder, but also as I said, a source of means of livelihood for them. They are pretty much dependent. Therefore, any kind of displacement or any kind of destruction of resources has strongly, or the extent of effects it imposed on the women is pretty much maximal. Or rather, on the other hand, the Gandhians would interpret by saying that the Chipko movement, through these symbolic protests such as prayer, fasting, and padiyatras, that is the ritual marches, in a way can be equated with the sort of the non-violent movement which is strongly espoused by Gandhi himself. So this sort of different interpretations is interesting to witness, that how the Chipko is also to be seen from a different perspective. Now I have begun talking about what ecofeminism is and the ecological feminist philosophies which guide it, and then how the feminists themselves tends to interpret the relationship between women and nature, and then the idea of domination of nature in a way is as a result of something which is being the domination of women, which is socially and culturally constructed. And for you to have a much more meaningful idea, I'll just briefly talk about the Chipko movement, which is partly seen as the first ecofeminist movement in India. So to have a much more wider understanding, you can please refer these references. I'll stop here.